The cabin was a hive of quiet activity. Passengers chatting softly, adjusting their belongings, and settling in for the long flight above 30,000 feet. The engines droned steadily, as if counting down invisible seconds while the sunlight streamed. Through the windows, casting fleeting patterns across faces and hands among the travelers, a woman sat quietly in the middle row, her gaze fixed on the seatback screen in front of her fingers, tapping lightly as if marking invisible rhythms. No one noticed her presence beyond the casual glance she gave the aisle occasionally, and yet there was something in the way she held herself, a calm precision that seemed to absorb the surrounding chaos. Passengers fidgeted around her, stretching their arms and legs, and the cabin crew moved up and down the aisle, offering drinks and smiling politely, but no one could sense the storm that was about to erupt silently behind the cockpit door. Suddenly, a low murmur of unease spread among the crew as the captain's voice came through the intercom, sounding strained and shallow. Passengers paused mid-conversation, looking around the cabin, unsure if they had imagined the faltering tone. The first officer moved with unusual urgency toward the cockpit, but hesitation flickered across his features, as if sensing something he could not yet comprehend. The woman remained seated, her eyes scanning the aisle and the rows before her. A subtle tension radiated from her presence. A click echoed softly from her pocket, and some passengers shifted uncomfortably, aware that the air had changed. The hum of the engines suddenly seemed louder, more insistent, as if warning them of impending danger, while outside the plane soared through layers of clouds, painting shadows across faces and hands, leaving everyone uneasy and uncertain. A ripple of panic began to creep into the cabin as the captain's voice cracked again, this time weaker, and the intercom fell silent. The first officer stepped fully into the cockpit and slammed the door with a force that made the cabin tremble. A sudden jolt shook the plane, tossing coffee cups and papers into the air. Passengers gasped, clutching armrests and screaming softly, their eyes wide with fear, while the flight attendants tried to calm them, their movements jittery and tense. The woman rose slowly from her seat and moved toward the cockpit with deliberate precision. Her movements calm and measured, like a predator aware of unseen prey. The atmosphere thickened with anticipation. Passengers leaned forward instinctively, some whispering to each other, while others simply stared, unable to comprehend the sudden shift in energy that had taken over the cabin. The plane pitched slightly as if testing its limits, and then leveled, leaving a tremor of suspense coursing through every body. As she approached the cockpit door, a faint beep echoed, signaling some form of communication. Only she understood. The first officer froze mid-step, eyes widening in realization of the identity that the woman carried silently with her. For years, passengers craned their necks, straining to see through the small windows of the cockpit door. The engines roared louder as the aircraft adjusted course slightly. The turbulence outside mirrored the tension inside the cabin. A sudden shudder ran through the metal frame. The flight attendants exchanged worried glances, aware that something extraordinary was unfolding, yet powerless to intervene. The woman reached into her jacket, pulling out a small device almost invisible in her hands. Her fingers danced over the controls like a pianist performing an intricate score, while outside the wind screamed and clouds twisted violently, casting shadows across faces and overhead. Bin's warning light flashed red on the control panel. The first officer swore under his breath and stumbled backward. A gust of air buffeted the plane, throwing it off balance. Passengers screamed, clinging to seats and overhead handles. The woman leaned in through the cockpit door and whispered a code that seemed to resonate through the metal walls. The first officer paused and looked at her with disbelief, and then a sudden understanding, as if decades of secret knowledge had been handed to him. In an instant, the plane dipped sharply over a pocket of turbulence. The passengers gasped. The engines roared, a deafening counterpoint to the silent authority that radiated from the woman. Her presence alone commanded the plane to respond, as if the aircraft itself recognized her control. The cabin shook, and every face reflected awe and terror simultaneously. She pressed a button hidden under her sleeve, and a soft hum echoed through the cockpit instruments, responding immediately. The first officer's eyes darted between gauges and her steady hands, and he realized that the storm outside was only a fraction of the threat they faced. A bolt of lightning arced across the sky, illuminating the terrified faces of passengers in sudden, stark white flashes. The woman did not flinch her calmness. A stark contrast to the chaos around her. A sudden jolt from the plane sent drinks flying and passengers shrieking into the air. She stepped fully into the cockpit, now moving with deliberate authority. Every passenger could sense that this was the moment the flight would either descend into disaster or be guided by a hand of extraordinary skill. The first officer swallowed hard and nodded slightly, acknowledging her command as the plane shuddered once more. A child began to cry softly, his mother trying desperately to comfort him. The cabin crew struggled to maintain composure while the plane rocked violently above a hidden storm front. The woman's eyes scanned instruments as if reading a language that no one else could comprehend. Each button she pressed seemed to anticipate the turbulence, as if the plane itself were obeying her commands. Passengers leaned into each other, holding hands, whispering desperate prayers. Some silently mouthing names of God, while others simply stared at her, waiting for any sign of the outcome. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, revealing nothing but calm determination and the faintest hint of a secret she had carried all her life. A click from her headset signaled a communication with someone beyond the plane, and passengers felt a shiver run through them as if reality had shifted. The captain slumped forward, barely conscious, and the first officer struggled to stabilize the aircraft. The woman moved closer, pressing buttons and flipping switches, her movements fluid, precise, each adjustment countering the chaos that threatened to consume the plane. The engines roared in response, and the plane leveled slightly, giving passengers a brief and false sense of relief. The overhead bins rattled, passengers clutched their seats and whispered amongst themselves, trying to comprehend the silent guardian who had revealed herself only when the storm demanded action outside. The clouds twisted and surged as if testing her authority. Every face in the cabin was fixed on her movements, some with awe, some with terror, each pulse in the plane echoing the suspense that hung thickly in the air. The first officer whispered something to her almost inaudibly, and she nodded subtly, a plan forming instantly between them, a silent coordination invisible to the passengers, yet palpable in the tension that filled every corner of the cabin. A loud clap of thunder shook the fuselage. Passengers cried out, clutching their seats. The lights flickered, and a gust of wind rocked the plane violently. The woman pressed a switch under her sleeve, and a small red light blinked on the panel, signaling some form of override. A low hum resonated through the cabin, as if the plane itself was acknowledging her authority. Passengers stared wide-eyed at the cockpit door, unable to look away as the storm outside mirrored the intensity inside. Suspense wrapped tightly around every heartbeat. She leaned slightly toward the first officer, her eyes never leaving the instruments, and whispered a few words in a language unknown to anyone in the cabin. His hands flew over the controls, the plane responding instantaneously. The turbulence seemed to lessen only slightly, but the tension did not abate. Passengers held their breath, every muscle tense, waiting for what would happen next. The woman pressed another hidden button, and the engines purred in response. The cabin quieted for a brief moment. Passengers exchanged bewildered glances, unable to comprehend the calm in the center of chaos. The plane jolted again, tossing a bag from the overhead bin, and a gasp swept through the cabin as the woman's movements suggested she had anticipated the unexpected, her call sign, yet unrevealed, hanging in the air as a tantalizing secret, leaving suspense at its peak. The flight attendants glanced at one another, exchanging silent questions and answers, their professional composure tested as the woman continued to move with unfaltering precision. Passengers leaned forward, straining to see any clue to her identity. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, a perfect mask of calm and determination. The first officer swallowed nervously, his hand steadying the yoke as he followed her silent instructions. The plane dipped slightly over a sudden air pocket, and passengers screamed, gripping seats and armrests. The woman pressed another button, and the plane leveled just enough to give a fleeting sense of safety. The storm outside howled louder than ever, as if aware that its challenger had finally stepped forward. Suspense filled every corner of the cabin as passengers waited with bated breath for what would come next, and who this silent guardian really was. The cabin was thick with tension. Passengers clutched armrests and each other, eyes wide with fear and fascination as the woman moved effortlessly toward the cockpit, every step measured and deliberate, her calm contrasting sharply. With the chaos around her, the engines hummed louder and the plane shuddered over pockets of turbulence that made stomachs twist and hearts pound. A flight attendant whispered to another, her voice barely audible under the roar of the engines, but carrying unmistakable worry as the passengers tried to comprehend the calm in the center of the storm. The first officer followed her movements closely, his hands trembling slightly, yet obeying every silent command as if guided by instinct. He glanced at her, and for a fleeting moment his eyes reflected recognition and awe. The woman leaned into the cockpit door and pressed a series of hidden switches, her fingers moving with a precision that made it seem as if the aircraft itself were alive. Responding to her touch, a soft hum resonated through the metal frame, signaling that some systems were engaging. Passengers felt the vibration through their seats, and overhead bins rumbled slightly. A flash of lightning illuminated faces twisted in terror and wonder. The first officer swallowed hard and followed her silent instructions, adjusting dials and levers that no ordinary pilot would dare touch. The plane lurched slightly, but corrected instantly. A murmur spread through the cabin, passengers exchanging confused glances, unsure if they were witnessing an emergency or some controlled miracle. The woman remained focused, her eyes scanning instruments with the intensity of someone orchestrating a symphony with lives hanging in the balance. A sudden alarm blared sharply from the control panel, startling passengers and crew alike. The first officer flinched, but did not hesitate, his hands moving automatically under her direction. The plane pitched violently over a sudden downdraft. Passengers screamed and a child cried as his mother held him tightly. The woman pressed a button under her sleeve, and the engines responded instantly, smoothing the turbulence like a hand calming a storm. The cabin erupted in muffled gasps and whispers, her authority undeniable, yet invisible. The first officer looked at her in disbelief, realizing that the woman who had been silent for the entire flight was now the only thing keeping them from disaster. The clouds outside twisted violently, lightning slicing through them like jagged knives, the storm testing her skill and resolve. She leaned closer to the instruments, eyes flicking rapidly across each gauge, her movements fluid and unhesitant, as if she had done this countless times before. The first officer muttered a few words almost inaudible to the cabin, but she responded with a subtle nod, her fingers flying over the controls in perfect harmony with the aircraft. The plane leveled slightly, giving passengers a fleeting sense of relief that was quickly replaced by the knowledge that the storm was far from over. A gust of wind hit the fuselage, throwing it into a sudden tilt. The cabin lights flickered and rattled. The passengers screamed again, gripping seats and each other desperately. The woman remained composed, a figure of calm in the eye of the storm, her presence alone commanding obedience from the plane. A click echoed softly from her headset, and the first officer's eyes widened, understanding the hidden communication she had initiated with someone beyond the plane. The engines roared in response to another subtle adjustment, her fingers dancing across buttons and switches as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Passengers leaned forward, straining to see any clue of her identity, their fear mixed with fascination as the aircraft responded immediately. To her every move, a flash of lightning lit up the cabin, showing faces pale and wide-eyed. The plane pitched sharply over another turbulence pocket, and passengers were thrown against seatbelts, their hearts pounding wildly. The first officer whispered her call sign under his breath, and she acknowledged it with a barely perceptible nod, leaving everyone in suspense. The storm outside intensified. The clouds twisted and roared like some living entity testing the resolve of the woman and the aircraft itself. She leaned over the control panel, her movements precise, her eyes locked on the instruments, as if reading an ancient code. Passengers exchanged frantic glances, trying to comprehend the impossible. Yet they could feel her authority radiating. Through the cabin, the engines hummed in a steady counterpoint to the chaos outside the first officer's hands, moved with growing confidence, guided by her silent commands, and every adjustment she made seemed to anticipate the turbulence before. It arrived, the plane shook violently as if challenging her control, and the cabin collectively held its breath. She pressed another button under her sleeve, a soft red light blinking, signaling some unseen override. The first officer followed her instructions. Without hesitation, the plane responded immediately, tilting and leveling perfectly, while the passengers screamed and held on for dear life. A flight attendant tried to reassure them with a calm voice, but her words were lost in the roar of the engines. The woman glanced at the cockpit door and then back to the instruments her face. A mask of calm determination. A click echoed, signaling another hidden communication. Her call sign remaining unrevealed to the passengers. Yet every person could feel the weight of authority in the cabin. Lightning flashed violently, illuminating the terror and awe on every face. The plane dipped sharply, and passengers cried out, clutching seats and armrests. The first officer whispered instructions, and she responded, with subtle gestures guiding him through maneuvers that defied reason. A low hum resonated through the fuselage, the metal vibrating slightly as if alive. The woman adjusted throttles and switches with exacting precision, the plane leveling smoothly. Despite the violent turbulence outside, the passengers whispered in disbelief, their hearts pounding as the storm seemed to challenge the very limits of the aircraft and the woman who now commanded it. A sudden shudder ran through the plane, and passengers screamed, holding tightly to their seats. The flight attendants struggled to maintain composure as the cabin rattled violently. The first officer glanced at her, eyes wide in both fear and trust. She nodded subtly, her fingers flying over the controls. Like a master choreographing survival, the engines roared a steadying counterpoint, and the plane leveled slightly, giving passengers a momentary sense of relief, only to have it dashed by another violent dip. The woman pressed another hidden button, a soft click resonating through the metal, signaling her precise control over the aircraft. Suspense hung thickly in the cabin, leaving everyone on edge. She leaned slightly toward the first officer, her eyes scanning the instruments as if reading invisible threats. His hands moved instinctively, adjusting controls, the plane responding immediately. Passengers held their breath, every muscle tense, waiting for what would come next. The storm outside howled in fury, lightning cracking dangerously, close to the fuselage, and yet the woman remained composed. Her silent authority undeniable. The first officer muttered words in a language only she understood, and she responded with a subtle nod. The plane leveled smoothly, despite another sudden gust. Suspense continued to grip the cabin, leaving everyone aware that the climax of this airborne drama was approaching rapidly, and her call sign still remained a tantalizing secret. The engines hummed steadily as the plane surged through another layer of turbulence, passengers gripping seats and overhead handles. The woman pressed another hidden button, a red light blinking softly on the console, signaling another system engaged. Her fingers danced across the controls with perfect timing. The first officer following without hesitation, the plane leveled again, giving passengers a fleeting sense of security, before the roar of wind and sudden jolt reminded them that the storm was far from over. She glanced toward the cabin briefly, her eyes scanning the terrified faces, then back to the instruments. A click echoed softly, signaling another hidden communication, and passengers shivered, knowing they were being guided by someone whose skill was beyond comprehension and whose identity was still unknown. The cabin was tense, every passenger gripping their seat. The woman moved with an eerie calm, leaning into the cockpit, pressing switches, adjusting dials, every movement precise. The engines responded instantly, smoothing turbulence. As the first officer followed her instructions, the storm outside screamed with fury. Clouds twisting, lightning flashing violently, illuminating faces frozen in terror and awe. She whispered silently to the first officer, who nodded, his hands flying. Over controls, the plane rocked suddenly, a gust throwing passengers against seats. A child cried. A mother tried to calm him. A flight attendant whispered reassurances, yet the woman remained calm. A silent force guiding the plane through the chaos. Suspense rippling through every heartbeat as passengers awaited the revelation of her call sign. The cabin was tense. Passengers gripped their seats, and each other, eyes wide in terror and awe as the storm outside twisted violently. The engines hummed. With a deep roar and the plane rocked unpredictably over sudden air pockets, the first officer followed the woman's silent commands, hands moving rapidly over the controls, every adjustment precise as if guided by an invisible hand. The passengers leaned forward instinctively, whispering prayers to themselves while trying to comprehend the calm authority that radiated from the woman whose call sign remained a mystery. She moved with a fluid grace toward the cockpit, pressing buttons and switches. Unseen by anyone else, the aircraft responded immediately, smoothing turbulence in ways that defied reason and physics. A flash of lightning lit the cabin, showing faces pale and wide-eyed. The plane dipped sharply over a hidden downdraft. Passengers screamed, and a child cried softly into his mother's shoulder. A flight attendant tried to calm the cabin with a reassuring voice. But the sound was drowned out by the roar of the engines. The woman leaned into the cockpit panel, her eyes scanning every gauge as if reading a secret language only she could understand. The first officer glanced at her with disbelief and awe, realizing that the life of everyone on board rested entirely on her skill. Her fingers flew over switches, pressing buttons with a precision that made the plane respond like a living entity. The cabin trembled under the stress, and passengers clutched armrests, unable to look away. The engines roared in counterpoint to the violent gusts outside. As the plane tilted sharply, passengers screamed, gripping seats and handles. The flight attendants moved carefully, trying not to draw attention to themselves while maintaining professionalism. The woman pressed another hidden button, a small red light blinking softly, signaling an override. She leaned closer to the first officer, whispering words that made his hands move instinctively, adjusting dials and levers. The plane leveled slightly, giving passengers a fleeting sense of safety, before another gust of wind rocked it violently. Suspense rippled through the cabin. Every heartbeat stretched to breaking point as they waited for what would happen next. Chi adjusted throttles and instruments with a deftness that seemed impossible. Every move, deliberate, precise. The first officer's hands mirrored hers with growing confidence, yet passengers could sense the storm had not yet released its grip on the aircraft. Outside, the clouds twisted violently, lightning slicing across the sky in jagged bolts. The fuselage vibrated under the force of the wind. The woman remained calm, her expression unreadable. A click echoed softly, signaling another hidden communication. Her call sign still a secret, but the authority in the cabin palpable. Each passenger feeling the tension like a living thing wrapping around them, leaving them frozen in suspense. The plane lurched suddenly, a violent gust throwing passengers against seat backs. The child cried again, his mother holding him tightly, while a flight attendant tried to soothe him. The woman leaned fully into the cockpit, her fingers dancing across switches, the engines responding instantly, the aircraft leveling. Despite the chaotic turbulence, the first officer swallowed hard. His eyes wide in disbelief at her mastery, he whispered under his breath, repeating her call sign in private as if saying it aloud might unleash forces beyond comprehension. The cabin. Lights flickered, the metal shuddered, and the storm outside raged like a living entity testing their resolve. Suspense held the cabin in a silent grip, leaving every passenger aware that the climax was approaching. A sudden alarm blared, signaling a minor system failure. The first officer reacted instantly following her silent commands. The plane tilted sharply again. Passengers screamed, gripping seats and handles. The flight attendants tried to maintain composure while the woman pressed another hidden button, her calm authority radiating through the cabin like a force field. The engines hummed with a steadying rhythm, the plane leveling smoothly. Despite the violent turbulence outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the terror and awe on faces. Passengers whispered amongst themselves, trying to understand the extraordinary presence that had emerged from silence to command the aircraft through chaos. The first officer glanced at her, eyes wide in both fear and respect. He whispered instructions in the language she understood, and she nodded subtly, her fingers flying across the controls, the plane responding immediately as if alive passengers held their breath, every muscle tense, waiting for what would happen next. The storm outside howled with fury, lightning cracking dangerously close to the fuselage. The woman leaned slightly toward the first officer, her eyes scanning instruments with precise focus. A low hum resonated through the cabin as the metal vibrated subtly, her hidden communications signaling control beyond ordinary comprehension. Suspense gripped every heart in the cabin as they waited for the revelation of her call sign. She adjusted the throttles again, each movement perfect in timing. The first officer mirrored her adjustments instinctively. The engines roared, a steady counterpoint to the chaos outside the cabin. Rattled slightly, passengers gripping seats whispered to themselves prayers and desperate words. The plane rocked violently, a sudden downdraft threatening to throw it off course. Yet the woman remained calm, as if in complete command. The first officer nodded subtly to her, and the plane leveled for a brief moment. A false sense of relief before the next violent jolt reminded everyone that the storm was far from over. Suspense thick in the cabin, hanging over every passenger like an invisible shroud. A gust of wind hit the fuselage, throwing a bag from the overhead bin. Passengers screamed, clutching armrests and each other. The woman leaned fully into the cockpit, pressing hidden switches and buttons, her fingers moving with precision as the plane responded instantly. The first officer followed her movements, every adjustment perfect. The cabin vibrated subtly, the engines hummed. The turbulence outside relentless. A flash of lightning illuminated her calm face, a mask of authority and determination. The storm outside seemed to challenge her skill, as if testing the limits of both her and the aircraft. Suspense gripped every passenger, leaving hearts racing and breaths held. The child cried again, a mother holding him tightly, a flight attendant whispering reassurances, while passengers clung to seats. The plane tilted sharply again, a violent gust of wind sending papers and belongings flying. The woman pressed another hidden button, a small red light blinking softly, signaling control was shifting to her hands fully. The first officer followed her silent instructions. The plane leveled perfectly, despite the violent turbulence outside. Passengers whispering prayers, some mouthing her name in silent recognition. They could feel the authority in the cabin, a palpable force. Suspense rippling through every heartbeat, leaving everyone aware that the revelation of her call sign was imminent, and that their survival rested entirely on her skill. A click echoed softly from her headset, signaling another hidden communication. Her eyes flicking between instruments, the first officer adjusting dials and levers, the plane responding instantaneously. A violent shudder ran through the fuselage, passengers screaming, gripping seats. The cabin lights flickered, the storm outside raging relentlessly. Yet the woman remained composed, her silent authority undeniable. Each Move precise every button. Pressed a calculated maneuver. The engines hummed in response, smoothing turbulence briefly before the next gust of wind tested the aircraft. She leaned slightly toward the first officer, whispering words no one could hear. He nodded and executed her command, suspense in the cabin reaching a fever pitch as the passengers waited in fearful awe. Lightning flashed violently, illuminating the terror and fascination on every face. The plane pitched sharply over a sudden. Downdraft passengers screaming, gripping armrests and seat backs. The child crying again, the mother holding him tightly, the flight attendants trying to calm the cabin, the woman pressing hidden switches and buttons, her fingers dancing across the controls as the first officer mirrored her every move. The engines humming, the plane leveling smoothly, the storm outside, relentless suspense, thick in the cabin, leaving every passenger aware that the climax was approaching and that her call sign still remained a tantalizing secret, suspended in the air. The cabin was electric, with tension, passengers gripping seats and armrests, hearts pounding, every eye fixed on the cockpit door. The engines hummed loudly, and the storm outside howled violently. Clouds twisting, lightning arcing across the sky. The first officer followed every subtle command from the woman, whose calm authority radiated like a force field through the cabin. The plane pitched sharply over a sudden, downdraft, passengers screaming, the child crying into his mother's shoulder. The flight attendants trying to maintain composure, while the woman leaned fully into the cockpit, pressing buttons and switches, her movements precise, deliberate, the aircraft responding instantly like a living entity under her control. Suspense hung thick in the cabin, every heartbeat stretching into eternity as passengers waited to see what would happen next. A sudden alarm blared, signaling another minor system failure. The first officer reacted, instantly, his hands moving instinctively over controls as the woman's silent commands guided him. The plane rocked violently, throwing passengers against seat backs and overhead bins, rattling the cabin violently. The woman pressed a hidden button, a soft red light blinking, signaling some override. The engines hummed steadily, and the plane leveled. Despite the turbulence outside, the child clung to his mother. A passenger whispered a prayer, others simply stared at the cockpit door, eyes wide. In disbelief at the calm figure controlling their fate, she leaned toward the first officer, whispering a few words, and he nodded, moving with perfect precision, suspense gripping every soul aboard as the storm outside seemed to challenge her mastery. Clouds twisted violently, lightning flashing, illuminating faces filled with terror and awe. The plane pitched sharply again, passengers screaming, gripping armrests and handles, the flight attendants moving cautiously while the woman adjusted throttles and switches, her hands flying across the controls. The engines roared, a counterpoint to the chaos outside. The first officer mirrored her movements instinctively, the aircraft responding. Instantaneously, a low hum resonated through the fuselage metal. Vibrating subtly, the cabin held its collective breath, every muscle tense, waiting for the climax. The woman leaned slightly toward the intercom, signaling. She was about to address the passengers. A murmur ran through the cabin, curiosity and fear mixing, as all wondered what this silent guardian would reveal. She pressed another hidden button, a soft click echoing through the cockpit, signaling final. Control. The engines hummed in response, the plane leveling smoothly over a violent gust. The first officer whispered words in the language only she understood, and she responded with subtle nods, her fingers flying over controls, the turbulence outside. Relentless lightning cracking dangerously close, the cabin, rattling, passengers holding tightly to seats, suspense wrapping around every heartbeat. The woman leaned toward the intercom again, and this time spoke, her voice cutting clearly through the cabin, calm yet commanding attention. Every passenger frozen in disbelief as they heard the words that revealed her true identity, and her call sign echoing like a clarion signal of authority and skill. Her voice carried a weight no one had anticipated. Calm, precise, every syllable deliberate. The first officer adjusting controls flawlessly, the engines responding to subtle tweaks, the plane leveling smoothly over the turbulence. A murmur spread through the cabin passengers, whispering her name in disbelief, awe, and fear. The storm outside seemed to pause as if recognizing her authority, lightning crackling briefly, illuminating her determined face. The child stopped crying, the mother holding him tight, still staring wide-eyed the flight attendants, frozen for a brief moment in awe of the woman whose skill had saved them all, suspense at its peak. Every passenger aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The first officer glanced at her eyes wide with both fear and respect. He whispered instructions, and she nodded subtly, her hands flying over the controls. The engines humming, the plane responding immediately. The turbulence outside, relentless, the cabin silent. Except for the hum and occasional gasp of passengers. The woman pressed another hidden switch, the plane adjusting instantly to counter a sudden violent gust. The storm outside roaring as if unwilling to yield. She leaned slightly back, allowing the first officer a moment to follow her precise commands. Passengers, gripping seats and armrests, every breath held, waiting for the resolution, suspense building to a crescendo as they neared the final moments of the flight. Lightning flashed, illuminating the terror and fascination on every face the plane pitched. Again, passengers screaming, gripping seats, the woman adjusting throttles and switches, the first officer following every silent command, instinctively the engines roaring in response, the cabin vibrating slightly, the turbulence outside relentless. She pressed another button, signaling final override, the plane leveling smoothly. Despite the violent storm outside, the child, clinging to his mother, passengers, whispering prayers and words of awe. The first officer glanced at her in disbelief and respect, realizing that the lives of everyone on board rested entirely on her skill. Suspense, tightening like a vice, every heartbeat in the cabin. The cockpit door slid open, fully revealing her in all her authority. Passengers craned forward, straining. To see the figure who had held their lives in balance for the entire flight, she stepped fully into the cockpit, moving with deliberate purpose, adjusting controls with perfect timing, every movement precise, the first officer following perfectly, the engines humming in response. The plane leveling smoothly, the storm outside still raging but less aggressive, as if acknowledging her mastery. The passengers whispering in disbelief, their eyes wide suspense, breaking slowly as realization settled. Over them, the woman finally smiled faintly, a small enigmatic smile hinting at countless untold stories, the call sign now echoing in their minds. She leaned toward the intercom, her voice calm yet authoritative, every passenger hearing clearly for the first time, revealing her identity, a retired combat pilot turned secret operative. Her call sign known only to the highest levels of aviation security, passengers whispering among themselves, disbelief, awe, and relief mixing as the storm outside seemed to bow to her mastery. The first officer following her silent instructions flawlessly. The engines humming a steady rhythm, the plane leveling perfectly, each adjustment calculated and precise, suspense giving way to a slow realization of safety, as the runway lights appeared like distant stars guiding them home. The plane descended steadily, the woman's hands guiding it with unparalleled precision, passengers holding breath, every muscle tense until the wheels touched the tarmac with a controlled grace. The storm seemingly dissipating the engines, quieting the cabin, erupting in quiet applause. Some still stunned, others shaking with relief. The child held tightly by his mother. Passengers exchanging glances filled with awe and gratitude. The first officer nodded deeply in respect. The woman finally leaning back, her small enigmatic smile, hinting at countless untold stories, leaving every passenger forever changed by the silent guardian who had revealed herself only when the sky demanded it. As the plane taxied to the gate, the cabin buzzing with whispered discussions, the woman finally settled back, her call sign, known her authority undeniable. The first officer still in awe, following her every instruction, passengers staring. At her in disbelief and admiration, the flight attendants exchanging glances filled with reverence, the storm outside a distant memory. Clouds clearing, lightning fading as if recognizing the end of a battle, the engines humming softly, suspense and tension replaced by relief, awe and wonder. Every heartbeat in the cabin remembering the woman who had stayed silent until the moment of greatest need. Passengers slowly disembarked, their eyes occasionally glancing back at the woman still seated. Calmly in the cockpit, her call sign, now legendary in their minds, whispers. Following them down the jetway, awe and gratitude in every step. The storm outside, fully dispersed sunlight breaking through the clouds, as if acknowledging her mastery. First officer following quietly behind her, every move filled with respect and disbelief. The child looking back, wide-eyed, clutching his mother a silent thank you for the guardian who had flown silently until the moment the plane demanded her command, leaving the passengers forever changed by the skill, courage, and secrecy of the woman who had revealed herself only at the peak of the storm.